I'm Alan Robarge, a relationship coach. Welcome to Improve Your Relationships, where I like to talk about attachment injuries and healing attachment trauma. And on this video, let's talk about grief and grieving. And I want to make it very specific to the loss of a loved one through death. Someone has died. However, what I'm going to share here, and when we start talking about grieving processes and the experience of grieving, it applies to many types of losses and many situations. Does not need to be related to the death of someone who has passed. However, I wanted to be very specific in this video and just acknowledge it, because some of my previous videos where I talk about grief and grief processes, I'm more referencing when relationship ends, when there's a breakup and an ending, and how we might experience that grief. Again, the grief doesn't necessarily have to be terribly different. In some ways, they're going to be very much the same. It's a loss, and it's about you entering a grief process and experiencing a whole range of states of mind and processes and what are referred to at times as different stages of grieving. But for this video, let's reference and let's frame it as someone has died, a family member has died, a loved one has died. It could even be your pet, feeling so attached and having a strong bond to your very important creature, your four-legged friend. That death can very much impact us. So a couple things, I'm just going to run through some ideas to think about, some experiences that you might be having, that we have when grieving and when grief is present. The first idea I want to share is that death and loss and grieving are inconvenient. It's never a good time. We are challenged to prepare and to plan, and even for some of us that know it's inevitable, it's on the horizon, if perhaps someone is sick and dying and we've been caring for this person, when it actually happens, it in general feels disruptive, and it feels like it's inconvenient, and it will not be business as usual. There is a change that occurs in our sense of time. The rhythm of time changes. So not only are we noticing the inconvenience and maybe even the impossibleness of it all, and we're challenged and overwhelmed with emotion and some sadness and a very provoked mind. We can feel on fire, we can feel unsettled, we can feel restless, and it's inconvenient, it's disruptive, and we're not able to go to work in the same way that we usually did or do. We're not able to sleep and participate in our everyday routine as we once did. Routine as we know it will get thrown out the window, and for some time, for many people, this could be months and months and months. It could even be years. There seems to be a particular number, and some of this might be a bit superstitious, folklore, coincidence, a bit of a mystery. It might be true, might not be true. But some people seem to report that the number 7 with 7 years seems to be a particular mysterious or magic number of a duration of grief. And so if perhaps you might be on the 7-year plan of really grappling and working with the intensity of what has happened, who are you going to be now? Grief makes us question our own what we know to be true and who we are as a person. It can very much make us come undone. especially if we're so attached to this person. We adored the person, we loved the person, this relationship was so important. So we're not only grieving the loss of the person and the loss of how we knew this person and the loss of who they were to us, and then we're simultaneously grieving the relationship. And we could even expand this further and to think about in bigger terms, what are all the losses that come by right of the death? If perhaps your friend, your partner, a family member was ill for a very long time and you were the caregiver, you lose your job, you lose your role as the caregiver. And that might have been a place where you really relied on being connected to your loved one. And so not only has this person passed and you're no longer in relationship with who they are, but you also don't have that role. Your identity as the caregiver has now changed as well. You might also notice that people around you change. You change, they change. It's very possible, and I'm just going to speak from experience, that when my father died when I was 14 years old, very quickly I noticed my mother also changed. And at the time, or a short period of time after that, I can remember comparing experiences with my sister and asking her also if she had noticed how mom is acting funny. And she confirmed and agreed, and we both acknowledged that my mother's personality and who she was just completely altered. And she was different. And again, back to this number 7, this idea of 7, it seemed to take 7 or so many years after that initial experience of when my father had died, before my mother came back, before she'd returned. So you could imagine my experience, or anyone who's in relationship to my mother, they're not only losing my father and not only losing the person who died, but then also realizing that life as we know it, in the relationships in the family as we know it, are all turned upside down and just, completely changed. And again, to repeat, this might be true of you. You've completely changed. And in some ways, the death and the grief process will permanently change you. You will mature and transition into a different chapter of who you are. I mean, how could it not? Because it is such a significant experience in life. But also over time, assuming perhaps similar to the example I give with my mother, is that also parts of your old self or aspects of your personality will start to come forward again, but in the immediate sense of post the death, and when you're in the trenches of your grieving, you might find that you lose parts of your personality. Now, one part of personality that people lose is their jovial, more lighter side, their humorous lighter side, their ability to just sort of enjoy life. It's very possible that you're going to feel like there is this wet blanket or a heavy blanket thrown over you. It's going to feel that there's something stifling you and that you're just weighted down. And this could feel that your personality is a bit lackluster, or it could manifest physically in your body that everything just feels really heavy. And moving forward through life is very, very challenging. So we need to be sensitive to how hard it is to operate and function at the same level of output that we once were able to do when the person was living. And that when we enter a period of grief, we are entering healing time. It is an altered state. And for some of us, it even throws us into a trance state. It becomes very surreal. And especially in the most immediate sense of when you just get the news that someone died, life can feel just so bizarre and weird, and everything that you thought was important, and having to the life of schedules and making sure that I answer this email and go to the groceries, life just falls away. It just doesn't exist. There's this entering a real surreal, raw nature. There's a exposed rawness to living in conscious contact with your grief. And for some people, this is too much. That intensity, that honesty, that raw honesty of life staring you back in the face. Now, something can be too much. Now, something else that also happens is that it can activate your own fear of your mortality or your own awareness of your mortality and make you question and just think about taking stock of your life. When are you going to die? And for some people, if that's associated with fear or being frightened or loneliness, then you might find that not only are you grieving the relationship and you're working with all these other layers and aspects of grief, but now you're also confronted with your own fear around your potential death. And I only say potential in the sense that you don't know when it's going to happen, but we can pretty much rely on the fact that we know it's going to happen. So it's this real unknown factor that we love to live in the darkness or ignorant of the unknown. And when someone else dies, it slaps us in the face that, oh shit, I'm on the list too. And this could be me next, or makes me really take stock and inventory of my life around, well, how many years do I have left? And how do I want to use those years? And what kind of relationships do I want to be in? And how do I reprioritize what is really important to me? Because if I'm confronted with this raw honesty of the reality of the finite nature of my life and the other people around me, all of a sudden, everything just seems a little more important. And so many times during grief process, what happens is that some of the superfluous ridiculousness of vapid wasting our life on silly reality shows. No offense against reality shows, but I'm just trying to pick certain things that they have the nourishment or the nourishing value of empty potato chips, and getting caught up in petty arguments, wasting your time being lazy, not investing in relationships to tell people that you care about them, not pursuing your goals, and just distracting yourself with some mindless clutter. We find when the raw honesty of grief slaps us in the face and we're really questioning this, what is life, quoting Hamlet, to be or not to be, to exist or not to exist, what the heck does that mean? And from an existential, grappling with our existence, an existential point of view, to really take stock of where am I at now and where am I going, oftentimes it's going to, some of the silly, ridiculous, petty things that we find ourselves hooked into all of a sudden get unhooked and we don't give a shit. And we also might find that we really change and prioritize our friendships. And we also might find that certain friends that we thought we could rely on are actually not reaching out to us, not reaching back. And we sort of recalibrate or reassess, well, what is the value that I'm placing on this friendship and this person? The last point I want to make, or at least the last point before I look at my list and just make sure that I hit everything, is that when we grieve and when we have been impacted by a major loss, it is also very possible that the current grief is going to link up and it is going to link back to some unresolved grief in your past. Now, in my history, this has really been challenging because I can have a relationship end and I'm attending to the normal everyday grief of the current situation of the relationship ending. However, it could link back into my psyche some unresolved grief around attachment trauma, and where I am still working and reworking and integrating and making peace with some of the history of growing up in a family and living in a situation with my family where there was a disconnect around bonding with me or having secure attachment or really fully being seen, known, heard, and understood. And so when I have a relationship end, and in this moment I'm just referring to not necessarily an ending through death, but just a relationship end, it's going to, the brain seems to operate, or this grief seems to operate in a network. And very quickly, it's going to move through this circuitous network and activate some of the previous grief. So as you could imagine, and if you've experienced this or you are experiencing this, this is really, really challenging, because in the moment, then you're flooded and overwhelmed. You're trying to make sense of, well, what is just the current grief of the current situation in my current adult self, and what is now all of this other grief from the past that's now simultaneously bubbling up, which is going to obscure my vision and obscure my ability to see clearly. And I also, when I'm linked to this younger childhood grief that gets churned up, I might developmentally, or I might link to my younger developmental self where I did not have the resources to manage this kind of grief. So then in a way I'm sort of doubly handicapped, because I'm overloaded with this wave of grief that's crushing me, but I also disconnect from my current adult self resources because I'm entered a state of mind of my younger self. So being able to pull out of younger self, come into current adult self, being able to attempt to compartmentalize some of the grief and take it all separately. And the best way to handle this is not to wait until you are overloaded and that you are living this experience. The best thing to do is to very actively grieve now when there's not even reason to grieve. And that means very specifically, purposefully, as a healing exercise, is to revisit some of your history, revisit some of your losses, and think of it as a kind of active, ongoing meditation. And how do you become witness to these losses so that you continue to keep them in the forefront of your mind and allow your nervous system to process some of the intensity and the energy and the feelings and the sadness and the loneliness, so that when life does present you with the surprise of someone dying, that you have already been doing your homework. You've already made healing work part of your lifestyle. My list says, just to repeat, grief is inconvenient, it's disruptive, it's groundless, it can be humbling, it zaps our power, can put us into a trance-inducing state so that it feels surreal. We will notice that it changes us and it changes others. So I hope that this is helpful. Please leave a comment. Please share your ideas about this video. If you would like to talk to other people, like-minded people who value exploring not only this topic of grief, but how it connects and relates to relationships and attachment injuries and secure attachment, there is a membership community that you can join. You can learn more about that on my website. I'll leave the URL here. You can also find it in the description on this YouTube video. And then lastly, please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you'd like to receive more videos just like it in the future. Thank you for listening, and I'll chat with you next time.